Welcome to the World of Rare Disease, a show that focuses on awareness and education about rare and complex disorders. My name is Julie Gertzley. I am an RN, the founder of Rare New England, and your host for today's show. Our show today will take a look at the Massachusetts House of Representatives, our legislature, and how the process works together. We hope to provide our viewers with an educational overview of the role of a representative in the legislative process and how constituents can influence policy. Today our show features Massachusetts Representatives Joseph McKenna and Hannah Kane. Welcome to our show, Representative
Thank
Kane
you.
Very good
and
to be here.
Representative McKenna.
Thanks for having us.
Yes. Okay, so what brought your interest? This is politics now. I mean, there are some who don't really understand the idea of politics. So I'd like to hear your interest. What brought you to be representatives? What brought that interest? What are you trying to do?
I mean, for me, public service has always been something that's been very important to my family, my grandparents, my parents. Were educators, were very much involved in their community. So for me, as someone who was very involved in my community before I ran, it's just sort of a natural progression to wanting to serve and to be able to work on issues like this that we cared about prior to entering public service, and certainly will continue to care about long after. But it gives us a platform and an opportunity to help advance things that we think are important.
Yeah, for me, like Hannah said, I've always been involved in my local community. Whether it was growing up, I was part of the rec committee in my hometown of Charlton. There was a short time I lived in the North End in Boston after I graduated, and I joined the Friends of the North End Parks. I didn't know anyone there, but it was an opportunity to get involved and kind of be involved in the community I lived in. And after I graduated, I wasn't really happy where I was working, so I got involved with a political campaign and just fell in love with the ability to impact on a greater level the communities I live in and the people that I interact with day in and day out. So when the opportunity presented itself, I was able to run and get elected and continue to do that.
Oh, that sounds awesome. I know over the past few years I've been learning a lot about legislature and the changes, the positive changes that people can make when they're working in legislation. So, thank you both for what you're doing. Can you tell me, like, in the day of a life of a representative, what can that entail?
Yeah, that's an interesting
No 2
question
days are the same.
there is no simple day in the life. It's very much not a 9 to 5. For example, we can have days like today where both of us are quite far from our district, but doing things that advance goals of ours and some of our priorities in the legislature. And we can have days where we don't leave our hometowns, and some days you're in Boston for committee hearings and trying to push bills, and some days you're grilling hamburgers and hot dogs for the local seniors doing a 4th of July barbecue. So every day is a little bit different.
And for the most part, other than when formal session is scheduled or when there's a public hearing for a committee we sit on, we largely determine our own schedules. Where is it that we want to extend our time and where do we want to make an impact? And so, as Joe said, a lot of the time is spent in the community that you represent. You may be meeting with local officials on issues. You may be at gatherings or events. You may be having office hours. You may be taping a show like this in your own community. But when we're at the State House, we're largely focused on either formal session, meeting with different advocacy groups that might want to come talk to us, either about legislation we filed or legislation that's in front of a committee that we sit on, or we're at public hearings themselves. And so, no 2 days are alike. You absolutely have no day that ever looks like another one.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. You're definitely in the public eye. You're definitely working with people, whether it is other legislatures or the advocacy groups, to find out where the issues are, other things going on in the community.
Yeah, and that's a good point, because as reps, we're expected to know a lot about many, many different things, whether it's environmental policy, healthcare policy, local economics, and it's quite frankly impossible to know everything we need to know. So we rely on those constituents and experts in whatever field we may be working with at a given time. So it's an interesting job that pulls you in many, many different directions. So in my mind, good reps don't pretend to know everything they need to know. They lean on others for their expertise and their experience.
And a lot of what we do too, which I think the public is really blind to largely, this part of our role, but we help constituents with issues they're facing. And so the folks that work in our offices certainly do a lot of that, but we also need to help people who may be facing an issue which is somehow either involved in the state level, or sometimes it doesn't actually involve the state level, but they turn to us because they don't know who else to turn to, and then we help them navigate back, wherever we can, whether it's a local issue or a federal issue. We work with our counterparts that represent on the federal level. A lot of times if there's an immigration issue, a passport issue, any of the things of those nature. So the constituent services, in addition to meeting with constituents because they have an interest in a bill that might be in front of the legislature, a lot of help on issues that they may be having that we can certainly weigh in and help.
And the great thing about constituent services in my mind is it's not partisan, it's not politically driven. I don't agree with very much of what my congressman does politically, but we have a fantastic working relationship, especially when it comes to constituent services. And I know that my office interacts with Congressman McGovern's office weekly, almost daily, and we have personal relationships and we get along great. And when we're trying to help people that we mutually serve, you put aside the politics and try and help people out, and generally that works out.
Certainly.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome. Now, what can you do as a representative? I mean, when we're thinking about constituents and they're thinking of, their problems, they see things going on in the community that are harming them, and they know they need change. So what can a representative do if they reach out to you? How can you bring about change?
So it depends on what the issue is. I mean, sometimes I'm redirecting somebody back if it's a local issue to talk to the Board of Selectmen or the town manager, depending on what their issue is. And our role is more to help affect that conversation to happen. Sometimes people come to me and say, I want you, to get this person fired in our community. They're not doing a good job. And it's like, that's not my role. I'm an advocate. I can help you have a conversation that needs to be had. We also advocate on behalf of the communities we represent, not just the constituents, but the communities themselves. And so it might be working with Mass Department of Transportation because there's a local road issue that the town wants us to help advocate for. But generally when constituents come to us, we sort of ferret out what's the nature of the problem, and then we determine how best can we help this person. Is it our office? Or is it simply making sure a conversation is going to occur and redirecting them to the right place to address the issue that they may have?
Yeah, and as Hannah mentioned, a lot of times we get calls from constituents who don't realize their issue is either state or federal that we don't necessarily control. And it can sometimes be a delicate call if we're trying to or get involved in a local issue, because some local officials don't like when the rep calls and they feel like you're trying to tell them how to do their job. And so for us it's kind of a delicate conversation to have, to redirect the constituent, this is who you need to talk to in your town. And sometimes we can mediate and help move a conversation forward. One of my favorite cases was one that we had nothing to do with. A constituent called because their neighbor was mowing the lawn and leaving the grass clippings too close to their yard, and they were upset with it and they wanted us to intercede. And that's clearly not something that a state rep does, but we were able to kind of mediate a conversation between the neighbor and the town and work it out. And for whatever reason they weren't able to do that on their own. So it's
and that's certainly very helpful.
Yeah.
Keep community happy
Yeah.
with each other. And some people can't do that on their own for whatever reason. So it's nice to have somebody to.
A lot of times, what I have found is even if you're unable to directly solve the problem that the person's coming to you, either because it's not within our wheelhouse at the state level, helping them have conversations with them and talking to them about the issue and helping them think through what might be the next step. People are very appreciative of that. And so it's not necessarily that we can always solve everyone's problem, but at least we can help either redirect them or to talk about who they might want to reach out to at the local level and how they could proceed with the issue. Government as a whole, for most people, whether it's at the local level, state level, or federal level, is very foreign. You don't know a lot about it until you all of a sudden have a problem that you need help with, and you don't necessarily know where to go. But especially being state representatives, because we're more in the communities, they just think, well, I'll call my state rep. And so our job is to facilitate conversations and to make sure that we're at least listening to their problem and trying to think through, how we might be able to help them or redirect them.
I think sometimes the more challenging as well is when constituents call and request a change in legislation that impacts them, where that is directly in our wheelhouse and it is something that we get involved with, but the legislative process is incredibly long, convoluted, and for a good reason, because legislation always has unintended consequences that aren't immediately apparent, and it's our responsibility to kind of vet it out and make sure that we're not passing a bill just because it sounds good that's 5 years down the road we're going to realize has all these negative repercussions. So we need to thoroughly vet these bills. In addition, the Mass Legislature has 200 members between the House and the Senate, each of whom have priorities, and so ultimately we end up with 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 pieces of legislation, and it's not practical to pass them all. So we have to work through that. And a lot of times constituents see a problem and it's very black and white, and they expect that the legislative solution is going to be quick and easy and clean, and it's not always the case. So trying to communicate that and help people understand the process and how long it takes, and help them to become good advocates without getting frustrated is something that we try to do.
And I think too that the legislative process, as Joe said, it's deliberative, right? It invites all parties to the table. Everyone has the opportunity to weigh in on something when you have a public hearing. And then the work that's done behind the scenes is really to make sure that we can gain consensus that this is the right way to address this issue. Many times you see bills that come before the legislature where it ends up being a unanimous vote. But a lot of work was done to get there to make sure that we're addressing the issues on all sides of it. And sometimes you don't. Sometimes you don't see unanimous votes or you have dissent on it, which is great too. But the part of the process that people should feel most assuredly about is they have the opportunity to provide input on it. So whether it's through us, whether it's directly going to a committee when there's a hearing on the bill, whether it's sending in a letter on something that you feel passionate about, it really is, even though we're the representatives that sit there and ultimately have to vote on something, everyone in the Commonwealth has the ability to weigh in on an issue that's important to them. And I think that sometimes people are surprised that they really have that voice, that it's not just our voices that are involved there, their voice can be just as strong and can make just as much of an impact.
Now, I know some people don't really understand the process. I mean, they think, if there's a problem and it seems a very obvious problem, well, why don't they just do something about it? So could you explain a little bit more about that process, the bill? You've mentioned the bill, just for our viewers to understand a little bit better what that means, what a bill actually is, what it does, and the process for that.
Sure. So as legislators, we have when we're sworn in, we operate on 2-year legislative sessions. So we're in our first year of the 191st session right now. And in January, we were able to file our bills, and they're called seasonably filing bills. You have a 2-week period of time. And so Joe and I worked on the bill that we filed, which is House 1934, and it's called an Act to Create a Massachusetts Rare Disease Advisory Council. Once we filed it, we also solicited co-sponsorship among our colleagues. So we sent out information to all of our colleagues, the other 198 members of the House and Senate, and said, here's a bill we filed, here's why it's important. Would you please join us in co-sponsoring this? And that solicited co-sponsors for our bill. And then it takes about a month once that period is done, and the bills get sent to all of the committees that are out there. So in this case, the bill was sent to the Joint Committee on Public Health, in which I sit as the ranking minority member on. The committee then takes all the bills that get sent to them, and they schedule them out for public hearings for the most part of the course of the next 12 months. And this bill has not come up yet for a hearing, but when it does, as we mentioned earlier, anyone who would like to come in and testify on this bill, whether they're for it, or if they have concerns about it, or they think that they have a way to improve it, can come before the committee when it's scheduled for a hearing and testify in person, or they can send in written testimony, which gets distributed to all the committee members. And then it largely becomes a product of what the committee chairs want to do with the bill. So then we start advocating to the committee chairs, trying to say, this bill is really important, can we work on getting it out of committee? We filed legislation that had language when we filed it But in committee, the committee can again change what the legislation says. So they might say, well, we're okay with part of it, but we want to change part of it. And then ultimately they put it up to the committee, whatever their recommendation is. So we're hoping that this bill would get a favorable recommendation at some point over the course of the next 12 months and get voted out of committee. And then it becomes a product of trying to advocate for it to move through the next levels. Sometimes bills get sent to other committees, so it's possible this bill could come out of our committee and get sent to healthcare financing. It's possible it could come out and go straight to Ways and Means. It's possible it could come out and go straight to sort of the third reading where it waits for an opportunity to move forward. So there's a long gauntlet that you have to go through to get legislation before it would appear before us as a body to vote on. We talked earlier, incrementalism is an important word where we work. So our goal, this bill has not come out of committee before, our goal would be able to get this bill out of committee at least this session. If it doesn't go further, that means that when we have to refile it in the next session, we would have a bill that would go to the committee and it would be noticed that this bill had already been voted out of committee, which is helpful because the bill will probably get scheduled earlier. That's typically what happens. Most committees take up bills that they've passed out favorably before but hadn't gone all the way through the process to becoming law. They schedule those for earlier hearings. And so, our job is to continue on a, day-to-day, week-to-week basis to figure out how do we move this bill down the field. I always think about it in football terms, right? Like how do you go from, starting on your own one down to, or on the opponent's one, all the way down the field and getting a touchdown. And so we will ensure that we always are focused on that approach. But of the 6,000 bills that get filed a session, somewhere between 4 and 5% become law. So there's a small fraction of bills that will make it all the way through the process in one legislative cycle.
And as Hannah mentioned, there's some 20 or 25 different committees, often with overlapping subject matters, such as public health and healthcare financing. Obviously, a lot of bills are going to touch on both of those areas. So as she said, it's not uncommon for a bill to go to both areas. And especially with public health, that's a very popular committee. There's many pieces of legislation filed that impact public health. So they have a larger docket than some other committees. And so if the chairman flags some bills for redraft or to amend language, the reality is it's not going to happen this week, next week. It's going to be flagged for perhaps in between formal sessions when there's more time to kind of dig into that pile. And that's why sometimes we'll see that incremental progress that Hannah talked about, where a bill will be marked, it'll be edited up, and then it'll be refiled the next session. So unfortunately, it's not refiled 2 weeks later with the corrective language. It's maybe the next session. So that's why sometimes these things take a long time, because they have, like I said, 100, 200, 300 bills, all which are getting tagged and edited and researched, and it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work.
And this year, too, we have 2 new committee chairs on public health. So for several years, we had Rep. Kate Hogan as the House Chair and Senator Jason Lewis as the Senate Chair. We have 2 new chairs this year. We have Representative John Mahoney as the House and Senator Joe Comerford. And they've been excellent. But, a lot of what they're seeing is new to them and new to their staffs. So it takes some time as well for them to get a lay of the land. But I'm very confident. They're both great legislators. They've been very interested in the legislation. And so I'm confident that we'll be able to move this bill, whether it's incrementally or all the way through the process, is what remains to be seen.
I mean, that's a good point. And I know as far as the rare disease bill that we'll be talking about a little bit more later, but this is the idea behind any bills that are out there, because there are other, obviously, bills out there for healthcare legislation and many other different things. So, and as you're saying, the changes. So I know from my understanding in my past few years getting more involved in legislation, that's the point too, that a lot of these people on the committees, they may not know about a certain issue that's being brought up. Of course, we're working with the rare disease. How can constituents help with that? How can constituents help other representatives and senators in the House understand what's going on, so that when they see a bill, they're going to have more understanding? It's not going to be like a foreign language to them.
I think telling a personal story is the single most impactful thing a constituent can do, whether that's through an email or a letter, or most impactful in a personal meeting. And as Hannah mentioned, sometimes constituents have this perception that we're kind of on a hill in Boston, but all you need to do is reach out to your state rep and say, are you available to meet for a cup of coffee? And I would bet whatever's in my wallet right now that that state rep, wherever they are, is going to make time to meet with a constituent over a cup of coffee and tell your story. Because when you tell your story, it's so much more impactful than even getting a one-page newsletter or bullet point on a bill, or getting an industry spec on a bill. Hearing how a constituent is impacted day in and day out, and the struggles that they have caring for a child, and educating the teachers and the healthcare professionals about what it is to provide for someone with a rare disease. Then when that bill comes forward, that representative or senator is going to say, oh yeah, Julie came in and talked to me last week, and that was a really touching conversation we had, and I could see the impact that it had. So don't be afraid to reach out and share your personal story and your personal, what impact the bills have.
I think the stories imprint on people in a way differently than just saying, this bill's important, please, support it. You really recall somebody's story with clarity when you're thinking about a bill. And so, whether it is, as Joe said, you send in an email and you talk about why this bill is so important to me. Here's how it would impact my family, or here's what not having this meant in terms of care or coverage for my family. And it's funny because we have people meet with us all the time who care about bills that we might not even have heard of that are before us. And a lot of times that also can pique our interest too. It's opening our eyes up to something that is, pending before the legislature. And sometimes I have been informed by a constituent of something that's important to them, and I go and I look at it and I think, this is a really good bill. I'm going to see what I can do to help support it. And so, it's a two-way street. It's not always just us sort of receiving information and telling somebody, okay, we'll look into it. A lot of times it's showing us that there's a way to advocate for something that we realize would be not only important to this constituent, but is in line with something that we think is important as legislators, an area or a focus. And so, that's, I think, the bill for rare disease not only has, personal issues for us in terms of why we think it's important, but when you go out there and you talk to other legislators, when we had the briefing on the bill, we had legislators come out to us that we didn't realize would have a personal connection to this bill, and say, oh, I'm so glad you guys are doing this. Like my husband, my daughter, my son, my grandparents.
Myself.
Yeah, myself. And so, it's one of those things where, as we said, there are so many bills before us that you can't possibly know everything that is filed there. And a lot of times it helps not only to talk to your state rep or state senator to let them know something's important, but also then to be there as an advocate. So it's, as Joe said, letting us know something is important to you is a great first step, but then giving testimony to the committee when the bill comes up is really critical. Again, you don't have to take the day off from work and come in and do it in person if that's not feasible, but a letter to the committee saying, here's why this bill is really important and how it has or would impact me is also helpful. So the one-on-one to your own legislators is important, but whatever committee has the bill that you're interested in, letting those members know. And all of that is really easily accessible. We have masslegislature.gov, and you can go on there and you can find any bill. You can see the committee it's in front of. You can click on the committee. It lists all the members. You can email them. It's not difficult to do that. And a lot of times we have people call our office who are constituents and say, I care about this bill, and how do I make sure that people know about it? And we'll send them, okay, here's how to send the committee a letter, an email and testimony for this. And so that's really valuable, as well as extending who knows that you care about this bill beyond just those that represent you.
Yeah, the state's website was redesigned just a couple years ago. Again, it's malegislature.gov. It's really, really intuitive, easy to follow, easy to search, easy to find
Track
out what
bills.
committees exist and who is on those committees. So, yeah.
Yes, yes, I've used that often, and I know that's something that constituents, if they don't know who their representative and senators are, they can also go on there and they can type in their zip code, their town, and it will tell them who their representative or their senator is. And if they want to know, let's say, in rare disease, for this example, are there any bills out there for people in rare disease? Type that in the search bar, it'll bring it up. Healthcare, type it in the search bar. And it'll bring up. So it is very easy.
Yeah, it tells you when the bills that you care about are going to have hearings. You can track, so you can put in that you want to get notification if a bill advances or something's happened to it. So it's really, really helpful. And a lot of times, again, when people contact us, they have no idea. I mean, it's just not something they know about. And once we let them know about, they think, oh, this is great. This is not difficult to be an advocate for something I care about. And I think that's like the biggest hurdle, is people think it's an insurmountable effort to advocate for something. And, you know, we want to make sure people understand it's actually very easy to advocate. It's easy and it's critical.
Yeah. And people believe it takes a lot of time, and they have to go to all these, you know, rallies and marches and hearings. And we certainly do appreciate the people that do commit that level of time. But if you don't have the time, like we've been saying, you can pick up the phone and make a phone call or send an email, and that can be the extent of your advocacy, and it's no less effective. You know, we rally the info sessions at the State House with, you know, constituents coming, but if that's not something that you can physically or, you know, take the time off from work, then there are other ways to get involved as well. It doesn't need to be a major time crunch.
And that's actually like what your role is to be representative of these people. And I know that's one thing that I try to do when I'm working with people, and I ask them if they know who their representatives or their senators are, and not everybody does. You know, you might be lucky if you get half the room's hands up, but then I'll ask them, okay, well, does your representative know who you are? And they look at me like.
That's a
why
great question.
would that even? But that's the whole point. They
Right.
need to know who you are. They need to know
Absolutely.
who your story and what is going on, because they're also on committees and they're also in the House and they're also involved in these bills, and they can share what's going on and help others understand why that's important. So I know we do work on that. Another piece now, sometimes I'm talking with families and I'll say, well, you need to reach out to your representative and let them know. And they're like, oh gosh, I'm just one voice. Like, why are they going to listen to me? Is my voice really going to matter? And then they don't always use the time. Can you say anything that would help that sort of situation and help them to realize that their voice does matter, and if each one comes forward?
Well, the alternative to hearing their voice is not hearing any voices, and then we think, well, there's nobody making any noise or advocating, so maybe it's not so important. So even one voice is a voice pushing us forward, you know, and like I said, the lack of that is silence. So that's certainly not a good alternative.
I think, you know, we rely on that. I mean, we rely on our constituents letting us know what's important to them. And so, you know, I always encourage people, and in this day and age, there are so many different formats you can use to get a hold of people. I mean, I get everything from emails to phone calls to Facebook messages to tweets to, at the end of the day, I go to bed thinking, did I like respond and see everything today in every communication form that was coming to me? You know, website links, things. It's just so easy to communicate with us. And as Joe said, it doesn't take, you don't need to worry that it's the most polished document. You're not handing something in to be graded. You're simply communicating, this is important to me. And so, you know, it can be 2 lines, it can be 2 pages, it can be whatever you want it to be. But it's absolutely critical that we hear from people. And again, you know, especially on the rare disease, this is an instance where we know that there are lots of people impacted by different rare diseases. But sometimes people think, well, I don't know anyone else, so I'm just not going to say anything on this. It must just only be me, or it must be only my family that's impacted, or I'm not. And again, it's that culmination of voices, which are really important. And so, you know, as Joe said earlier, if we're not hearing from people, we're led to believe that this isn't important. In the landscape of life, this isn't something that's a priority for them. And I do know it's difficult to find time sometimes, right? Especially if you're dealing with medical issues, either you, yourself, or a family member. The thought of adding one more thing to your day just seems impossible. But, I always look at it, are you sitting in a waiting room waiting for a doctor? Are you, you have some downtime to kill in between appointments. What do? You can literally right there on a cell phone go on and connect to our email addresses or your legislators' email addresses and send them a quick email. It can happen anytime. And you can send it first thing in the morning, late at night, during your lunch hour. I mean, it literally would take, less than 5 minutes to find out who your legislator is and send them a quick email just saying, this bill is important to me and here's why. And, if you have time to talk, that's great. Here's my cell phone. If you could call me at some point and have a conversation about it. Our drive into Boston, I try and, if I'm not commuting at 5:30 in the morning to avoid traffic, I try and make constituent calls when I'm driving in or driving out of Boston. It's a great use of my time. I'm in the car. I can't text. I can't do anything else. I can drive and I can talk. And so,
But not at 5:30 in the morning.
no, not, well, I don't think there's many people at 5:30 in the morning who want to get a return phone call from me. But I just feel like, we're always doing that as well, as how do we maximize our time and make sure that we're able to have, every conversation that people want to have with us. So,
Yeah. And I know sometimes it's a learning process for people because they're not into the politics piece. They're not following that. And then they have these young families and there's somebody who's sick and they're spending all their time in hospitals and with doctors and
Right.
legislation's just not.
right.
Like, why would I need legislation? And I know I learned, like I'm a nurse. I went years and years. I never paid any attention to
Yeah.
politics and legislation. But when once I get into the rare disease world, I see that connection and how legislation really is a part of good healthcare.
Yeah, and you used a key word in politics, and our job is politics to get elected, but then once we're elected, it's legislating. And sometimes constituents say, oh, well, I didn't vote for Joe or Hannah, or I really don't like this other bill that they're supporting. So they may have a fear or an anxiety about reaching out. But once we're elected, good reps, and I can't say that universally, but good reps put that aside, and I'm going to help you regardless of whether you voted for me or not, or whether I think you're going to vote for me in the future. We don't weigh politics when someone calls us and says, I need to talk to you about pre-existing conditions and healthcare coverage. That becomes a human story, and we're going to help that constituent regardless of the politics of that equation. And so it's important for people not to be turned off or hesitant to get involved because of their perceptions of the political side of that.
Oh, yeah. Thank you for saying that, because I think that does make a difference for some people. I think that we can get stuck in a certain role, and so that makes a very good point.
I think too that you can't underestimate that so much of our role is just working with people in our district. And so that is, as Joe said, it doesn't matter if somebody voted for you or not. You don't know that. Charlie Baker said after he won by 42,000 votes that in his first 2 years traveling across the Commonwealth, he didn't meet one person who didn't say, I was so proud to vote for you. And he's like, I only won by 42,000 votes. There's no way that. But, I think the point is, once you're in office, once you have won, you are then there to serve everybody in your district. And issues like this, they rise above partisanship. And I said earlier, a lot of, when bills come to us to be voted on, a lot of them end up being voted on unanimously. It's not a partisan issue. It's that there was a good piece of legislation produced that we can all be proud of and see the benefit of voting into law. And when you're at the State House, I tell everyone, you'd be hard pressed to walk around the State House and figure out which party people belong to. It just doesn't work that way. We don't label ourselves. We don't operate in a way in which you can decipher whether we're Democrats or Republicans. But the bigger point is the majority of people in the Commonwealth are unenrolled. So while there's two parties at the State House and there's one legislator among us who is an independent, the majority of people in the Commonwealth are not members of a party. So, for the most part, If you're a voter, you're probably not registered to a party anyways, so the politics end of it should be blind to you in terms of thinking through somebody. And when you introduced us, usually what we're known by is our district. I'm the 11th Worcester District, you're the 18th Worcester District. That's how we become known. Representative Hannah Kane, Representative Joe McKenna. There isn't any party attached to us when we're out there working with constituents or advocating.
Yeah.
I recognize you as two very passionate people for constituents, from what we've been doing too in the past several months working towards this rare disease bill. So I want to thank you for that.
Absolutely.
And I want to thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you for all you do.
Thanks for being, yeah.
Before closing, we provide our viewers with an opportunity to share comments or ask questions from our prior shows. R&E in Motion is the perfect way to expand upon our mission of engaging with our community. Please send us your questions and comments to info@rarnewengland.org. We will share your responses on our next show. From one of our last shows, we received a question asking who the target audience is for the world of rare disease. And the answer is everyone. Everyone who is interested to find out more about rare diseases and resources available for this community. Thank you for your inquiry. That's our show for today. From all of us at Rare New England and all the patients and families who keep rare disease in motion, thank you for watching. And remember, when you hear hoofbeats, think horses and then zebras.